What are going to be the effects of the Federal Reserve's inflationary policies? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show, as you all know, brings you the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round of Libertarian Angle.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. If you're new to FFF, you can subscribe to our FFF Daily. It's a daily publication. We consider it the best libertarian commentary page on the internet on a daily basis, our Future Freedom Monthly Journal. And you can also support us with tax-deductible donations, for which we're always appreciative. Okay, Richard, we've got a somewhat of a big event in the world taking place, and that is that the Castro regime in Cuba has finally come to an end.
That's true.
I'm sure this saddens you, that given your propensity to love socialism and so forth. Yes, did you want to say something immediately?
I have nothing against Castro. In fact, I grew up watching Castro convertible couch commercials on television.
Okay. Well, I'm referring to Fidel Castro, who, of course, died several years ago. But after he passed away, his brother took over the reins of power. And then he just recently resigned. And so this is the first time since 1959 that the Castros have not been in charge. So that really raises a question that you and I have been raising for the whole 30 some odd years that FF has been in existence, is what are we doing with this brutal embargo? That is the U.S. government's embargo against the Cuban people. What's that all about? I mean, it seems to me like this would be an opportune time to finally lift this thing and stop criminalizing the right of American people to travel to Cuba and spend money there. And so that's what, I think we ought to raise in this segment of Libertarian Angle is what's this thing all about? Why is it still there? The Cold War supposedly ended back 1989, 1990. Cuba was at the center of that Cold War. Americans had to live with this Cold War hype about this communist outpost 90 miles away during the entire Cold War. And so why didn't the embargo get lifted at that point? Instead, it just continued on and on and on. And my hunch is that it was because the CIA and the military were still terribly angry over what happened at the Bay of Pigs and what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this was all about vengeance, that they were never going to rest easy until they retaliated against the Castros, preferably through a regime change operation. But absent that, they were going to wait them out till they died. Well, now they've died, so why not lift the embargo now? It's been a brutal foreign policy tool against the Cuban people. It has always targeted the Cuban people with starvation, preferably death in the eyes of the national security establishment, as a way to get the Castros to resign or to get the military to oust them and put in another pro-U.S. dictator. So if you just permit me, Richard, I think I'd like to put this in a historical context. That if we go back to the Spanish-American War in 1898, that was the beginning of U.S. control over Cuba. That the U.S. intervenes in that conflict with the idea that they're going to assist Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines to gain their independence from the Spanish Empire, which was a brutal empire, no doubt about it. But it was a double cross. It was a lie. The U.S. knew that as soon as the war was won, that they were now going to step into Spain's shoes and take control. And they did. They took control over Cuba and Philippines and, of course, Puerto Rico, Guam. And they would not relinquish that control. They had U.S. troops occupying Cuba for a long time. That's how they got Guantanamo Bay through a fraudulent lease that was done under duress. But indirectly, they maintained control over Cuba for about half a century, a little bit more. And then in 1959, the Cuban people decided they were going to revolt against the U.S. supported dictator there, a guy named Fulgencio Batista, who was about as corrupt and brutal as dictators come, even though he was pro-U.S. He had gotten into bed with the mafia, this criminal organization. They were running the casinos. They were giving him a cut. The CIA was all involved with supporting Batista. They thought he was wonderful. And then what precipitated the revolution, people think that Fidel Castro initiated the revolution. It really wasn't him. That Batista had this policy of sending out his government goons in the countryside to kidnap young girls, minors, and then bring them back to Havana and serve them up as sexual perks for the well-heeled gamblers in the mafia's casinos. And there's a woman named Celia Sanchez who had one of her young friends be victimized in this program. And she's the one that actually started the Cuban Revolution, and then Castro gets involved in it. But there was a real reason why people were very dissatisfied with Batista's dictatorship. So they win, the revolutionaries win, and Castro ends up being installed into power. And before long, he says, look, we just want our independence. Well, that didn't go over very well with the U.S. government. They'd been controlling Cuba all this time. And so the tensions start ratcheting up. That's where the embargo comes in. Castro starts turning to the Soviet Union for support. And the thing just gets totally out of control. And so you've got the Kennedy administration with the Bay of Pigs invading Cuba with these Cuban exiles. You got the embargo. You have Operation Mongoose, which consists of sabotage and terrorism. My question, Richard, is what authority did the U.S. government have to do any of these things? I mean, Cuba is a third world country, but an independent country. I mean, why doesn't it have the right to have a communist regime or a socialist regime, regardless, without interference with the U.S. government? I mean, we've had this socialist welfare state here in America since Franklin Roosevelt's administration, and nobody questions the right of the American people to establish their own socialist economic system. Why didn't Cuba have the same authority? And where in the Constitution does it authorize the U.S. government to have an embargo or assassination attempts? That's the other bizarre thing about this, is that the national security establishment took the position is, well, if a person's a communist, we have the authority to kill him. Really, where does that authority come from? It's certainly not in the Constitution. Neither is the authority to impose an embargo. And so I think that's where we really have to think in this country is a deeper level, a fundamental level of what business did the U.S. government ever have in interfering with the internal affairs of Cuba? Why wasn't that their business from the very beginning? Because there's no question, nobody refutes the fact that Cuba never attacked the United States, never threatened to attack the United States, never initiated any kind of violence. Under what authority did the U.S. government initiate sabotage, terrorism, assassination, and embargo against the Cuban people and against Cuban officials? What do you think, Richard?
Well, I'm a little frustrated by what you said, because since we've been moving more and more in the socialist direction, I've been waiting for the Luxembourger or Liechtenstein liberators who would come over us and free us from our socialist regime. I want the Luxembourgers to free me. Where is their armed forces to make America free? And you seem to not be sympathetic to that type of foreign policy. So I'm really depressed. But, you know, I think you also have to be a little cautious here. I mean, the United States didn't jump into these things like the embargo. I mean, John F. Kennedy waited until he had successfully had a large inventory of Cuban cohibas before he really signed off on the embargo, you know, because he had to make sure that his convenience and comforts with a smoke would not be disturbed by the requirement of him breaking his own law. So, I mean, people didn't rush into these things. It was tempered and proportional. But to be more serious, obviously, it's the mindset of the United States government, regardless of administration, that is Republican or Democrat, more left, more right, in the usual lexicon of these things. It has been an attitude of the U.S. government and its foreign policy establishment since the 1940s, that it is the duty and the responsibility of the United States to play keeper of the flame of its definitions of freedom and democracy around the world. If not for the United States, Hitler would have conquered much of the world and would have been unable to be overthrown. Then in the post-war period, there's the Soviet Union. And if not for the United States, communism would have enveloped and taken over the world. Therefore, the mantle of global salvation fell upon the shoulders of the United States. Now, that mindset is the one that led to the U.S. Remaining in West Germany, in its occupation zone in Germany at the end of the Second World War, in the formation of NATO, of its emergence of military and alliances with Asian countries, with the insistence that any extension of the appearance of communist control in a Western hemispheric country would bring down the power of the United States to prevent it getting a toehold. This was the case in Guatemala in 1954, for instance. It was the reason why the United States was sympathetically supporting the Batista regime against Castro's rebels during the civil war in Cuba that began in '59 and ended with Fulgencio Batista boarding a plane right on the early hours of January 1, 1959. And as he flies off to Spain, Castro and his forces enter Havana. And so as part of this, the U.S. has said that Cuba must not be allowed to be a toehold of communism in the Western Hemisphere. As you said, 90 miles from Key West. And as a consequence, they therefore determined that the only legitimate government that could be in Cuba is one that was at least neutral in some way, that they would talk about neutral third world countries, but more preferably one that was aligned with the United States, regardless of its ideological labeling. There's a story that during the Second World War, during one of his Oval Office press conferences with selected members of media, Franklin Roosevelt was asked the question, why is it that we're at war against fascists like Mussolini and Hitler, but we're supporting a fascist like the dictator Trujillo in the Dominican Republic? And the accounts I've read, the stories I've read, is that Roosevelt leaned back in his chair with his cigarette holder, in his mouth, in that inclined direction. And he said, Trujillo is a fascist, but he's our fascist. Now that's the mentality, okay? That is the mentality that the US government has had. During the entire Cold War, the idea that it was the free world versus totalitarianism became an umbrella under which the US government was willing to give political, military, and economic support to virtually any dictator, however brutal and cruel and oppressive, in Africa and Asia and Latin America, as long as it either formally or informally aligned itself on the American side in Washington's conflict with Moscow. That led to this insistence that, as well as part of this, the United States had to do everything, having agreed as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis not to attempt an invasion of Cuba anymore, to quarantine it, right? To quarantine it. And part of this quarantine effort of US policy ever since then has been the idea that we impose an embargo, do not allow Cuba to prosper by trade, by exchange, by investment from any number of countries. In other words, intentionally or unintentionally, to tighten its connection and dependency upon the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. Now, what was the result of the embargo, which has been in effect now for over 60 years, over 6 decades? The fact is that it has not prevented the Castro brothers, when Fidel was alive and through Raul's life, to live a life of comfort and ease. The fact is there is a communist ideological ruling class in Cuba, as it was in all of the communist countries. They're the party leaders, those who manage the government industries and staff in executive positions in the bureaucracies. They're like a ruling class. Were they denied food? Were they denied the comforts and ease and amenities of a special life better than the average Cuban? No. Upon whom has the embargo primarily fallen? It's fallen upon the average Cuban citizen. The inability to acquire dollars, the inability to import whatever goods, however meagerly, the government under its own communist controls would have allowed into the country, the inability of allowing Americans to visit Cuba. You know, the U.S. government during the Cold War always talk about, wanting to foster cultural interactions across the Iron Curtain, to let people on the other side of the Iron Curtain experience and learn what free people are like through art, music, literature. The Cuban people weren't allowed that. They were frozen out from any opportunity to interact with, learn from, and be fostered and inspired by meeting with ordinary Americans. The U.S. was sending over artists and jazz musicians like Duke Ellington and Count Basie to Moscow. But these people were not allowed basically to go to Cuba. So basically what it was an economic and cultural stranglehold on the Cuban people. You know, there's this almost caricature image of Cuba in which you have these Cubans, to the extent that they have private cars, are driving around in these cars built in the United States before 1959, the classic Chevys. And, they become, masters of being able to mechanically keep the cars running. These people have been kept in an historical bubble by the U.S. attempt to prevent them from interacting with the rest of the world. One of the things that struck me, Jacob, is that when I started traveling in the Soviet bloc countries in the last years of the Soviet Union, is how much it had mattered to people, particularly in Eastern Europe, where foreign interactions were not as stringently regulated or prohibited as in the Soviet Union itself, how much it mattered for Poles and Czechs and Hungarians to have had the opportunity to meet Western Europeans and Americans and to interact and clandestinely get a piece of literature or a magazine or a book, or to be able to get, the old records, right? Going back a while, the old records of, decadent bourgeois jazz and rock music. This mattered to these people, and it helped inspire them to want to be, when they could throw off the shackles of the Soviet Union, as occurred beginning in 1989, right, to try to become the normal societies, which they called us, which they had seen glimmers of through the holes in the Iron Curtain, through those interactions and opportunities that did exist, and for them to want to become more open and free and prosperous. The Cubans have been kept in this hermetically sealed bubble by American embargo. Now, I'm slightly exaggerating by the following reason, because we have kept this up, but as the decades went by, other countries chose not to. Spain was interacting financially and culturally with the Cubans, a growing number of Latin American countries, Canada. How did an American get around the travel embargoes against Cuba, since no American airlines were allowed to fly directly from the United States to Havana? You went to Canada and you got a visa from the Cuban embassy to visit Cuba, but to avoid it being in your actual passport, so the U.S. Customs Authority would maybe see it at some point and confiscate your passport, and therefore you couldn't travel after that. I mean, so it wasn't as if it was absolutely closed, but the influences came from other countries. Americans were not allowed to do this, and Europeans were investing. I mean, the embargo has been going on until there was a slight loosening up during the Obama years. But the fact is, the Canadians, the French, the Spanish, they were investing in Cuba in the hotels. It's not as if we're preventing trade. So in fact, this has increasingly been symbolic and not substance. And it is one that has prevented people only 90 miles from us to interact with the country that supposedly is supposed to be the ideal of freedom. They have been denied this opportunity. They've been culturally weaker. They've been made weaker. They've been denied the degrees of freedom that interacting with Americans would have permitted, and it has been disastered. By doing this, It has helped the Cuban government retain its power over its own people. Look at the bad Americans. They won't let you trade. They won't let you have a better life. They're trying to economically strangle you. They won't let their people to come here and learn how wonderful socialism is. Okay? So in fact, it is acted as a tool for the purposes of Cuban communist propaganda. The sooner it's gone, the better.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. The Cuban regime loves the embargo. They may rail against it, but they're able to use it as the excuse for why everybody's suffering. It's not their socialist system that has caused this. Oh, heaven forbid. No. If the embargo wasn't there, socialism could really prosper under the Cuban plan. Maybe not in the Soviet Union, but the Cubans could do it. And so they've used this blockade very, very effectively, what they call the blockade. That they know that if that were lifted, all of a sudden now they've got to answer to the Cuban people for what they're doing to them with their socialist system. And you bring up an interesting point about the cigars, and it raises the notion of how they run this program. It really is hypocritical and corrupt. You know, I went to Cuba many years ago. So how do I do that? How did I do that? I went there legally, flew out of Miami. Well, I applied for a license from the Treasury Department. In other words, would you give me permission not to travel to Cuba, but to spend money there? Because you see, from the very beginning, they didn't want to make it illegal to travel to Cuba because they understood that freedom of travel has always been considered a natural God-given right. So they didn't want to create this appearance that they were destroying natural God-given rights. So instead, they said, well, we're just going to make it illegal to spend money there, but not period. Illegal to spend money there without our permission. So as long as you have their permission, then there's no problem with spending money there. But without their permission, threat to national security, the Reds are going to take over America. So I got permission to spend money there. Then I had to go get a visa from the Cuban authorities to go as a journalist. But what everybody needs to recognize is that this embargo is not just an assault on the Cuban people. It is an assault on the American people, on our freedom. The freedom to spend your money however way you want is as natural and God-given and sacred as the freedom of travel or freedom of religion or freedom of speech. It's your money. It's your private property. And they have made it a felony offense. That's the point of this embargo, that people in Cuba don't get sent to jail for violating the embargo. It's the American citizen that gets sent to jail by his own government for spending his money in his own way. And make no mistake about it, they will do it. If they know and they have evidence that you've gone to Cuba and you've spent money there without their official permission, on your return, they will arrest you, they will indict you, and they will prosecute you, and they will do their best to put you in jail. All for this heinous crime of spending your money the way you want. So it's an infringement on our right of economic liberty. It's not just an attack on the freedom and well-being of the Cuban people to interact with the American people. Freedom of association. There's another right that is infringed upon with this embargo. And you're right, Richard. It's so counterproductive that what the embargo did was centralize power even more in the Castro regime. As things were clamping down economically, as things were compressing, not just because of the socialism, but also because of the embargo, what happens? The government starts rationing. The government says, we got an economic crisis. They do exactly what they do here in the United States. You've got an economic crisis. It's time for more government control. So if they were trying to get rid of the Castros, they were doing the exact opposite. We are supposedly a free country, and obviously I underline the word supposedly, but in order to fight socialism in another country, why adopt socialism at home? Why adopt government control? The best way to fight socialism is through freedom. Free the American people to travel and trade and spend their money any way they want. So all of a sudden you have this flood of people coming into Cuba, as you intimated, interacting with people, talking to people, spending money there, and therefore opening people's minds up to the possibilities of what life would be like without this socialist regime. That's the way you fight. I know that when I went there, I was interacting with people, and people there out in the streets, they hate their socialist system. They know that the world has left them by, but you know they loved Fidel Castro. They loved Raúl Castro because these guys established Cuba's independence from the U.S. They didn't like the CIA controlling their country. So you had this weird dichotomy where they really didn't like their socialist system, but they really liked their independence. But I interacted with people freely. There was a group there that actually were very libertarian that I met and went to a dinner with them. And in one guy's house where he invited me in, there were books by Mises and Hayek and Friedman. And this is the type of thing that would be amplified if libertarians and everybody else were free to travel there. And then it would be up to the Cuban authorities to say, oh, we need to restrict travel here and restrict entry of Americans. This is getting dangerous. But at least then their hypocrisy would be exposed rather than the hypocrisy of the U.S. government.
Let me understand the causality here. You get the U.S. Treasury to let you travel to Cuba. You spend money there. And then a few decades later, Biden becomes president and we start having even more socialism in America. I'm seeing causal links here. If only the U.S. government had not allowed you to spend $1 in Cuba, we would not have Biden as president today. You're the cause. You did it.
Instead of me influencing Cuba to turn toward free enterprise, they influenced me to turn toward socialism. So better to keep Americans at home, right? Because it's too dangerous to get infected overseas.
But you know, the thing is that throughout, from virtually the time that the communists came to power in the Soviet Union, and the same policy was then followed in all other communist countries, the presumption that you must hermetically seal off the people to re-educate them in the truth of socialism and the evil of communism, so that the next generation does not fall into these evil capitalist ideas. Now, in a sense, by the U.S. placing these restrictions on freedom of movement, whether to go to Cuba or go to North Korea still today, and then before, you know, even being able to, you know, travel to other communist countries, even when it wasn't prohibited, the idea that, you know, it wasn't fostered or recommended, was the idea that, you know, Americans might go over there and they're going to learn things that the American government might not want them to learn. The same way the Soviet authorities didn't want Westerners to come into the Soviet Union and indoctrinate people there with these evil capitalist ideas. I can assure you that even at the end of the Soviet regime, when I was traveling there, and all of that type of most restrictive nonsense was passed because they were allowing joint ventures then with Western companies, there was still the residue of the attitude that people should be suspicious of being seen to be interacting with Westerners, because you never know the response of the authorities if they chose to come after you.
All right. On that insightful note, we're about out of time, so we'll wrap things up. Greatly enjoyed the conversation as always. Again, those of you that are new to FFF, you can subscribe to FFF Daily. We've also got a great online conference taking place right now called the National Security State and the Kennedy Assassination, which, by the way, delves a lot into U.S. government policy toward Cuba during the Kennedy administration. We've got a monthly journal called Future of Freedom, and of course, we welcome your support. Richard, I enjoyed the conversation and look forward to talking to you next week.
And thanks to our viewers and listeners, and remain free. Freedom to spend, freedom to work, freedom to live, and freedom to travel.